My name is Felix Nash. I'm a cider merchant and I run the Fine Cider Company based in London. But we supply a lot of wonderful restaurants as well as bars, pubs, all sorts, all over the UK. But growing up in Somerset, cider was always about, there was always that little proximity. And I suppose, you get quite accustomed to that. It's just a bit of a way of life. You see orchards, even in our little garden, the old apple trees. We used to have a tree house in an apple tree. My dad would bake apples, the old coring one, putting in some raisins, a bit of butter or something. Old photos of me as a little child picking apples, with just some little dungarees on. There's that kind of proximity you have in Somerset, I suppose. And almost didn't know how much it was there. It's really fascinating working in cider now and seeing behind just the most evident stuff, seeing the real depths to it. But it's fascinating knowing that just in daily life growing up, the apple tree's about the proximity being in a place. There's still always been that connection. Even through the swathes of how cider has changed in various ways, there's always been that little bit there. It was really having discovered in Herefordshire, or partly having discovered Herefordshire, as a lot of people won't know that much about Herefordshire. They might be used to having gone across to Wales and the Welsh mountains. They might know bits of the Cotswolds or whatever. Herefordshire, though, was that real little gem just nestled on that side of the country. And discovering the place and discovering various ciders from certain makers, some of which still were in, the kind of old school bottles that I'd thought cider to look like for so long, but just being amazed by the liquid. And I was living in London, had a warehouse space I'd taken on with my brother, and I was doing little food and drink events, actually. I'd never really worked in the industry. I did one shift at a pub once when I was a teenager, and it was like a trial shift, clearly never got the job. But I'd always liked cooking, and had started doing these dinners. So there'd be maybe 30 people, 40 people, 50 people even. At first, friends who were chefs would cook. So friend Matt Liddell, who was the number 3 at the 3 Michelin star restaurant, Alan Ducasse at the Dorchester in London, he did one. It was me and him in our little warehouse with a little gas cooker. And we used an artist's studio to plate stuff up, and it was like 6 courses, I think, and it went on to about 3 a.m. because the amount of time it took, and everyone was quite drunk because they had like tiny bits of wonderful plates. But it was really fascinating. That was proper, kind of the first insight I properly got into that kind of food, understanding a bit of how that world works. And I started cooking then for some of those dinners a little bit. I used to be in the art world a bit, and after Frieze Art Fair I did one with mussels. I went to Billingsgate Market at 3 in the morning, got loads of mussels and cooked those up in a lovely old sauce. But it was really having discovered those ciders in Herefordshire, thinking, oh, actually I could try selling these. I like food and drink. You cannot beat the beauty of the British countryside. As much fun as it was being in the city then. And so it just ticked a lot of lovely boxes. And I also felt from the art background, maybe I could lend something useful, have some skills to apply in terms of things like presentation, be it from the photography and how we talk about things through to the bottles and the labels themselves. But they were the vehicle that I could test some of these ciders. They were the means of getting lots of friends to taste things and say, what do you like? Sometimes that was on the labels, other times it was blind. And I learned a lot of what I know, a lot of the foundational stuff from doing those, being able to really see. And of course that really, the whole thing with that was, giving people food as a reason to get them there and to drinking the ciders and giving me all this feedback. I mean, everything started off really with food and cider pairing, it was very clear from that how naturally and wonderfully cider pairs with food. A lot of the kind of food that you'd have when you're doing a tasting, the cheeses that you can wonderfully get on, realising just how well cider and cheese compare and go together. I mentioned mussels, the seafood side, how incredibly well that can work. It was all just very, very clear. So once got really rolling as a cider merchant, I guess I had a bit of a nice background to be able to tell restaurants and places that, oh, this with this was really good. And it seemed a really useful means of kind of elevating cider. The restaurants being such gatekeepers of quality, if we want to prove to people just how good cider can be, they're such a conducive place to start. It's been fascinating how we can often have the same cider in a little local pub or shop, and then also a Michelin restaurant. I mean, we do a lot of iconic restaurants, a lot of Michelin restaurants, from the young and just brilliant, like Carter's of Moseley, just outside Birmingham, through to the iconic of the past, from places like the Fat Duck, through to places like Lyle's and the Clove Club, which are currently the two restaurants in the UK on the world's 50 best list. And that was a really fascinating thing to experience in early days, when you're like, why don't more people know about cider like this? Why is it not understood and appreciated? But at the same time, you're getting an incredible restaurant stocking the exact same stuff as the bloke in the local pub, and they both love it and appreciate it, and you realise, oh, okay, yeah, there really is something good here. And yeah, in the pub, cider with the Sunday roast can be the most wonderful of pairings. And then but it's really fascinating to get more insight, as I started to because of that, into the way that restaurants pair food and sommeliers. And a big part of that was like when you have restaurants that do pairing menus, you know, you have a set list of dishes, and they really pair drinks to them because they are wanting to pair that. It's not the customer making the choice. So if they don't know about cider, and they don't, you know, it might just be a few words on a list if you've got a bottle on someone's wine list. At least then when the restaurant is doing it, they can give someone this fascinating new experience of a cider of a kind of calibre and quality that someone's never experienced before, but they know it pairs beautifully with that food. And that's just glorious. It's great for the restaurant. It also, you know, a lot of the best ciders, you're not talking the prices of wines, so they could also give people a fascinating experience at a slightly better price, or they can make sure they could, you know, make the margin they need to. And that really got things going in the food and cider pairing for us. And the real joys with that for me, of course, would be times I go to a restaurant and do a tasting, and they bring one or two of their dishes out to test. Having those experiences. We also started doing various things with cheesemongers, like there's Paxton Whitfield, very kind of iconic old cheesemonger in London, cheesemonger to the Queen and all that kind of stuff. Doing pairings with them for magazines and articles and other bits and pieces is just glorious. You know, spending a few hours with a set of wonderful ciders or perries, really going to those details on pairings, because when you do get a pairing that really works and elevates both things involved, it's just incredible. And you do get pairings that stick in your head, you know, that you go back to. I mean, I always love a bit of Oliver's Gold Rush with the big, you know, that tannic Herefordshire cider fruit, lovely bit of acidity and a lovely fruitiness as well. That with fish and chips, I think always wins, you know. And you get those kind of keystone pairings, you start connecting dots in your head. The way that I like to think of it with food pairing is in the kind of more vernacular way than some people might. With something like wine, there's so much kind of history and cumulative knowledge between people that using more technical terms can really work and make a lot of sense. And, you know, very chefs and people might understand a lot of that. But I still think there's a lot to be understood and done in cider. And I think actually the sort of vernacular side of it is maybe the most useful. And that's where, I mean, it's nice I'm sat here. This is the table I ate at growing up as a kid. This is where all of my early food and drink memories come from. And that's the fascinating thing about taste and smell, that each of us has their own unique dictionary, basically, of smell and taste from across your life, everything you've tasted and drunk. And it is unique to each of us. It does vary. Of course, there are some things that basically everyone can agree that's a bad smell, you know, and certain things that most people tend to like. But it is always distinct and it is unique. And that for me is always kind of the starting point. you know, it's using that big old bank in your head of things that you've put together or things that have gone together. Eat very well-known things like red wine, you know, with beef, with steak, where you have those lovely tannins, which many people will recognise, you know, the kind of concept of what tannins are, that textural and bitter kind of astringency towards the end of the taste. Very prominent as well in tea, particularly say if you leave a tea to brew for too long. Say you're then taking that as a starting point, you've got wonderful tannic red wine and cider. Well, if someone tells you that Herefordshire grows some really tannic cider fruit, and you got, say, a very nice still dry tannic cider, and of course a lot of people know of Herefordshire beef and the quality of that, well, you can start to connect dots and test things, you know. Same as if you have some fruit, some apples that might produce slightly more citrusy flavours. Perry pears as well, of course, can really do some really lovely citrusy things. Well, again, anything you're using lemon and lime in, start to think, you know, you can get those correlations. So you can use what you know and then sort of connect the dots a little bit. It does kind of hark back as well to that lovely principle of what grows together goes together. It's not always the case, obviously, but it's a really great starting point. And that's the key thing. It's more finding a starting point and finding a couple of things that work really well. As well as tannins though, the acidity side is a huge factor. So you can, once you get really stuck in as a pphémélier, you start to be able to get pretty good at guessing what will pair. But ultimately, pairing at the end of the day, for the really good pairings, it all comes down to taste. You'll get some general rules and principles, and sometimes you'll try and pair a cider with some food, and it will really bring out a lovely fruitiness in the cider, but you slightly lose an element of the dish. It's really aiming for that gold standard where both things actually are elevated. And for me, I love it most when, with a pairing, it's sort of the trajectory of taste that a drink or food has in your mouth. When between the food and the drink, they're sort of elongated and that transition is really wonderful. That's when they're working really well. The acidity side, you can take as a really good example, and the way that can work is with fats and food, you know, like cheese, like meats, all sorts of things though, that have a decent fat content. The acidity will cut through that fat, wonderfully kind of cleansing the palate. Rather than things building up and accumulating in your mouth, you're getting this sort of little refresher each time. You're getting this broader kind of experience. So there are basically certain principles and rules that you really get to apply. But I love the vernacular approach where people just say other things they like, feed it in, you know. Terms like umami can be a bit strange to get your head around. And even then, I think these things are complicated enough that just getting stuck in with those pairings is always the best way to do it. Finding one or two things that work, so you know what it's like when stuff really works, and then nicking bits of good things that pair anyway, you know, from wine. Stuff that, you know, the way that you can put white wine with whitefish and shellfish, well, again, you can start to take then some slightly acidic ciders to put in that role, or again, perry. You know, if I said to someone, try some shellfish with perry or whitefish with perry, see what combinations you like and you get. Try a bit of tannic dry Herefordshire cider with beef. Try, if you like the more natural wine side of things, get a really nice kind of natural wild fermented cider, put it with some charred barbecued vegetables. You can get some really fascinating things going on there. Try a 𝗕𝗵𝗲 cider, again with the shellfish side, that could be really, really glorious. Or an ice cider and such like with cheese. Start off with some things that a lot of people will say work, and just build up your own little register of a couple of things, and then you'll very quickly get a bit of an instinct actually for what might work. It's really fascinating. Once you have tasted a good few ciders, you really will start to be, you know, drinking something and think, oh, this would be good with that, or you'll be eating something and think, oh, I would love this cider with this. Again, kind of what I would term as East Coast fruit. So cider that's made from apples that are more on the eating and dessert end of the spectrum than the traditional cider apple. They tend to be slightly lower in alcohol, low tannin content. Mostly the acid is the main kind of component that comes across. You can kind of think of them like the white wine of the cider world. There, you know, I really love a wild ferment East Coast fruit cider with lamb. You know, you can get these wonderful acidity and these slightly herbaceous sides, but there's still that kind of sharp fruitiness. And it's pretty similar in some ways to mint sauce, which obviously goes really well with lamb. If you get these things kind of right, you can get really nice sharpness and acidity. So that's the way I think of it. You latch on to a couple of like keystone really nice things, and then you'll start making the dots. You know, you are adding some new chapters to your own taste dictionary of the smells and tastes that can go together, and getting stuck in that way. Because also, ultimately, as it is a personal thing, taste, you know, if we do tastings, we've done a lot of events like this, be it from wonderful ones with restaurants like Brunswick House in London, wonderful chef Jackson Boxer, again, or Lyle's, with the wonderful chef James Lowe. We did a cider lunch a few years back, lovely sold out event with kind of 5 courses, each of the makers there, with a dish paired with each cider. The maker would stand up, tell you about it, the chef would tell you about the dishes. It's such a lovely way to eat, and then you're drinking those things created by that person there that paired beautifully with the food. Say we did a couple of years back a trip out to Herefordshire with a bunch of wonderful chefs. We had James and Jackson both came, the guys who run the Marksman, which was the Michelin Pub of the Year a couple of years back. We had even the likes of Fergus Henderson and Trevor Gulliver, who are the founders of St John, often known as Britain's most iconic restaurant. And that was really eating a lot of the best Herefordshire produce. We made sure everything we had was from Herefordshire, all the 3 counties. Some wonderful cheeses. That really was the what goes together, kind of goes together side of things. Yeah, it's really wonderful seeing the way that chefs latch onto and love and appreciate what cider can do. They really, you know, there's some smart people in the world of chefing, and they're very, very passionate, of course. And having them, you know, kind of think of and appreciate cider in that way has always been the real proof in my mind that, you know, just how good it is, and really how well it can pair with food. I do think, even though I'm biased, I do think cider as an all-rounder pairs better and more broadly than even wine, you know, let alone beer. The elements you have that you can use really conducively, that acidity side can be so useful in cleansing a palate, in cutting through things. The fruity side can be so glorious, you know. A lot of alcohol doesn't really have, or has very specific versions of fruit. Those little touches of fruity sweetness and succulence can be really wonderful to play with against the savoury side of food. Then having, yes, from the citrus elements, all sorts, you know, that's just, yeah, really fascinating. It was back, I said, in 2014 I started doing this, and how much stuff has changed is really surreal and wonderful, particularly these last few years. Be it in the UK with, you know, like Merlin, 𝗬𝗍𝗶, the wonderful restaurant in Bruton in Somerset, taking cider as their sort of starting point and their main focus as a drink, rather than wine or whatever else. With so many places, you know, cider then will be present, but it's, you know, the smaller or newer thing. And you're starting to see cider kind of as the focus and stand on its own legs. And actually, even just the other week, there was an article in the Times talking about cider in France. And cider in France is really been a fascinating thing. France was the real bastion for some of the best cider making in the world for quite a long time. But it's really often been kind of viewed, or it's sort of played second fiddle to wine because of the prominence of wine culture there. And it was just this article in the Times with this wonderful headline sort of the young or youth swap bourgeois wine for cider. And it's a mixture of the issues of price, but also just it being this fun, lighter thing. You do get to the point where you kind of think about the nature of good cider and how conducive it is. I think it's really going to take this role sort of between beer and wine that fascinating nothingly kind of properly occupies, with so much of the properties of wine that people love, the sense of locality, you know, the seasonal making, the regional variation. The fact that you have all of that, you have all of those wonderful, fascinating layers to it, to explore each year, the new vintage, for example, and yet at the same time, you're talking on average about half the alcohol of wine. You are really saying, this is a thing. This is a drink that, particularly in Britain, for example, with the history in the past, the era where it was known as the native English wine, drunk from diamond etched and engraved cider flutes, that you have a culture that can exist there. You have so many wonderful cultures across Europe that work with wine and then have incredible food culture that go alongside it. In Britain, food has been going, through fascinating stages in the last few decades. That old reputation of Britain as not a good place for food and drink has completely changed. It's getting known, as the sort of food capital of exciting things in Europe, given that it's got so many different influences going on. It's not honed in the manner that French cuisine has very much its form. There's all sorts of things going on in really fascinating ways. And that's the way I think things will go. And cider, I think, has a great role in that. It is as that native English wine kind of thing where you're having stuff from regions, places you might have visited when you were a kid, grown near hills or mountains or whatever else it is, bits of coast that you know and you visited, you understand what it looks like, where they come from. And I think that's the thing that chefs are definitely latching onto more and more with it. I say it's just wonderful to see the way that it feels like it started to become a necessity for the good restaurants to have cider on their list, basically. That's the stage we're at, and it's going to be really amazing to see what happens in the next kind of 5 years. And where it ends up, who knows, wonderful cider bars or restaurants that focus purely on cider. Cider's definitely got the capabilities to do that. And, I do love the idea that, yes, it can, being often slightly lower in alcohol than wine, you can have a lot of fun with it. You can get for a great value often something absolutely incredible. And also that low alcohol thing. Some of my early kind of archetypal memories of this kind of cider, having discovered some cider makers in Herefordshire, was having lunch in the sunshine in summer in Herefordshire, and cider was the drink. The way that it can really fill this kind of summer wine role as well, I think, is absolutely glorious. Yeah.